This is Module 2 of Mar Yeshua, the Unknown Jesus, dealing with Jewish prophetic and priestly mysticism. Now, approximately 2,000 years before the Christian era, a group of nomadic Semitic tribes that were native to the area around Ur, where Babylon was, found themselves discriminated against by Hammurabi, who wrote his code on the side of the great Hammurabi's code on the side of great cliffs, discriminating against these wandering shepherds who would come to the city to trade for goods. They were getting to be too much of a problem. Perhaps there were many of them that were bandits. In any case, we find archaeological evidence and even names of some of the tribes that migrated north up the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they have the names Abram and Terah. Now, we're told of the patriarchs in the Old Testament that Abraham and his father Terah migrated to Haran, where the arrow is pointing right now, and there Abram had his visitation, his vision of the great God. There was no name for this God, but this was El Elyon, the God of all gods. And here Abram's name was changed to Abraham. He took his people and his tribe, and he went south because he was told to go this direction, to follow this star, so to speak, and this God would make his descendants like the sands of the sea. And eventually the wanderings of Abraham took him into Egypt, and eventually back out of Egypt into Canaan. And it was there in Canaan that he encountered the priest of this same God, the God Most High, El Elyon, the priest of God named Melchizedek, which means the king of righteousness. And Melchizedek was the priest who served him a sacred meal and taught him many things. Now, at this point in Jewish history, among the patriarchs, there is still no name for this God. When you look at the origins of Yahweh, of Yahwism, the Most High God, El Elyon, does not have a name yet. We know that the name of Abram was changed to Abraham, and in the time of Abram, we know that he had contact with one who is called a priest of El Elyon, God Most High, Melchizedek, and he offered him a special sacred meal of bread and wine, and he was a priest of God Most High. But it's later, generations later, that God is given a name or receives a name. And that is at the time of Moses, many generations later. Moses is an Egyptian name, as in Ramoses or Tutmosis, and there is quite an Egyptian and Edomite connection with all the legends about Moses. The legends about Moses are adaptations of the legends about Sargon, King Sargon, from 2,000 years previous. The story of being put in a basket in the water and taken out of the water and being saved by the royal family and so on, are really reapplications of much earlier legends that we know from earlier literature. According to Moses, according to the stories and legends of Moses, Moses was ejected from Egypt because he beat to death and killed an Egyptian guard who was abusing Hebrews. Even though Moses had been raised in the court of the Pharaoh and spared from the death that all the firstborn children of the Jews had received, he felt somehow a deep sympathy with the Jewish people. And when he saw these injustices being done, he got very angry and he killed this Egyptian guard and had to make a hasty exit out of the country across the sea into the area of far south of Judea. Now, this is the area occupied by the Kenite tribe. And the priest of the Midianites who lived in that area was named Jethro. And Moses met his daughters and finally married them, married a few of them. Zipporah is the most famous of them. And it's there that he had his vision of the burning bush. And there in the theophany of the burning bush that he received the name of God. He said, when I go to your people, who shall I tell them has sent me? And he says, tell them that, and here's the name, Yod He Vav He has sent you. Now this could be, would be an abbreviation for I am that I am, or I will be what I will be to you. And even later in the New Testament, the intensive I am, ego eimi, is understood as a divine reference, and it's used in John's Gospel. Jesus refers to himself that way over and over, which is obviously a Christological statement. But at this point, God receives a name. Now the name is not able to be pronounced, or is not supposed to be pronounced. It's known only to the priesthood. And because names are very, very powerful things, and the name of a God is the most powerful both weapon and source of blessing that one can have. And so this is the God who sends Moses forth to redeem his people. Now, as we look at the history of the Jewish tribes, as they go from being tribes to nations, actually 2 nations, we see this kind of a progress. Moses, who seems to exist around 1300 years before the Christian era, leads, according to legend, a huge number of people out of Israel, out of captivity, into the Holy Land and into the desert of the Sinai. Now, if in fact the number of people that is claimed in the legends of the Old Testament were true, then they would stretch in columns 4 deep all the way from Alexandria to Jerusalem. There's no way at all that that many people could have even undertaken such a journey. Probably it's metaphorical for all the people who were in the loins of the people who were yet to be born, other generations. We also don't find any real historic evidence of a great slave escape during this period of time. In fact, the legends of the Exodus don't really become important in Jewish history until the time of the Babylonian captivity, which is 800 years later. And at that time, as Jews retell their history, they put a great emphasis upon the story of Moses and the Exodus and link that with the Pesach, or Passover festival, which earlier seems to have been a kind of spring festival where people did a kind of limping dance. Had nothing to do with what we think of as Passover or the celebration of human dignity and liberty. So Moses, who undoubtedly was a true historical person, but the legends concerning him and concerning the Exodus and so on are much more dubious, was the founder, basically, of Yahwism. And that kind of Yahwism is shamanistic. Moses is reputed to have been a great magician. He was more powerful than the Egyptian magicians. When he threw his staff on the floor, after they had thrown their staffs onto the floor and they'd all turned into snakes and serpents, he threw his onto the floor. It turned into a bigger serpent and it ate up all their serpents and so on. And again, the place where he had his theophany, the place where he had his contact with God, was in the desert. Now, his successor was Joshua, which is exactly the same name as Yeshua. Jesus was his name, Joshua. And Joshua was the one who took over the leadership of the tribes after their legendary wandering of 40 days in the desert. We can't but help think of Jesus' 40 days in the desert with his contacts and so on. But Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, and we have legends of the walls falling down when the trumpets were blown and things like this. It's very interesting that when Jericho was first excavated in the 19th century, it was found that the walls of the city from that period of time had indeed fallen down, but usually when cities are invaded, they fall inward, they're pushed inward. But in this case, they had all fallen outward. So it was indeed some kind of very unusual, miraculous event associated with Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Jericho being one of the oldest cities that there was in the area, probably dating from around 9,000 years before the Christian era. So Joshua became basically a military leader who led the conquest of these people who had come out of Egypt against their previous generations of cousins who lived peacefully in Canaan and who were not herdsmen, but who were in fact farmers and settled peacefully in Canaan. Now the period of the Judges, which happens after the time of Joshua, is the time when the supposedly 12 tribes, but at least a great number of tribes of the descendants of those who had done the invasions in Canaan and so on, where they endured various kinds of attack and assault, and each time God raised up a judge. That means a charismatic leader from just the mass of the people who would lead them into safety. And there are many judges. There are women judges as well as men judges. And there are many stories you can read in the book of the Judges and so on. This was tribes who were in what was called an amphictyonic alliance. There was no king in Israel. They were all separate, independent groups, a kind of confederacy, and their main agreement was when one of them was attacked, they would all come to their aid and fight against whoever had attacked them. And so that was this basic form of cooperation, which you also found among the Greek city-states at about the same time or a little bit later, was the way that these people survived as a people. Now, about 1,000 years before the Christian era, a great warrior and leader named Saul came to the fore. Now, Saul was dealing with a very difficult situation. The middle kingdom of the Egyptians was crumbling because they had been invaded by people of the sea, the people of the sea. We know them as the Phoenicians. And these people were living in the Iron Age. They had learned how to make fires so hot they could melt iron out of rocks, and they could make swords and weapons with them. And one man with an iron sword and shield could simply shatter the swords and shields of 8 or 9 armed soldiers armed with bronze weapons. And so these people with advanced weapons technology had come over the sea and come into Egypt in boats and basically just taken whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted. And Egypt was in shambles, and they had moved up the coast of what we think of as the territory of Israel now, and they had taken over the best and nicest land. And they were known now as the Phoenicians. And these are the people from whom we get the stories of David and Goliath and so on. And what happened is the people of descendants of the tribes that Moses had led and Joshua had led were forced to move up into the highlands and live with much more scarcity and much less nicely as the Phoenicians took over their area. However, the Jews never learned the secrets of making iron weapons, but they were experts in trade, and so they, in the times of peace between the Phoenicians and the Hebrews, they would trade with them and trade with them for their Iron Age weapons, their shields and their swords, and then they would go to war with them with their own more powerful weapons, and sometimes manage to defeat them pretty well, carve out more territory for themselves. And Saul was one of these guerrilla leaders, and he was of course succeeded by David. Now Saul had been crowned by the prophet Samuel. Now you have to understand that prophetic religion is the religion that tries to preserve the original religion of Moses. It's the religion of those who are inspired directly by God, who speak directly with God. They are shamans, they are shamanistic, they are people with unusual not only psychic powers but physical powers, and very, very much are the backbone of the religion of the Hebrews. And so authority for something like the crowning of a king over all these tribes that had been living independently and operating in a confederacy was a major thing that was opposed by many of the prophets. And the prophets lived, many of them, in the woods. There were even later to be guilds of prophets, sort of like monks. And they were very much opposed to the idea of taking a census, numbering Israel, having a king over Israel. No, Israel was to be a theocracy. It was to be run directly by God and God's inspiration. But Samuel the prophet, the greatest and the most respected of them, agreed to anoint Saul as the leader of all the tribes. And that was an anointing, was literally what would later be called a christing, a christening. And so one might say that Saul was the first of the messiahs. So this was a giant step. The tribes were now united under one leader, one military leader, and they simply had to be in order to survive. Well, of course, the successor was David. Now, David was considered himself to be a prophet. He danced shamanically with the prophets. He sang incantations. He knew how to heal with the music of the harp, and he was considered to be really an archetype of what later would be thought of as the true anointed one of Israel, when later Israel looked back to looking for the anointed one or the king sent by God to redeem them. And so he was thought to be the one out of whose line the Redeemer of Israel would come in the latter days, 900 years later, 1,000 years later. Now, David was a very successful leader. He waged many campaigns. The time of the year that they went out to war was at what they call the turn of the year, in spring, in about April. And that, by the way, is why April and Aries are associated with warriors and warfare and so on. That was a time that people were able, because of the weather, to go out and start their new conquests. And he built the holy city in Judea called Jerusalem. And he defended the city. The story is told, the legend is told in the Old Testament, that one night, sitting on his rooftop, and that's the way the buildings were constructed, that you had kind of a patio on your rooftop so you could look across to other places and have a high vantage point, that he saw the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Now, David was the king. He could do anything he wanted to do. And so he asked that this woman be brought to him. Her name was Bathsheba. And he immediately was madly in love with her, although he had other wives, like all the great Hebrew kings did, and most of the tribes people who could support them had multiple wives. And he spent all of his time making love with her. Now she became pregnant. She was married to Uriah the Hittite. He was a Hittite, one who had converted to become part of the kingdom of the Hebrews. which is called, later would be called the Kingdom of the Omri. And he was totally loyal, and he was fighting the wars of the Hebrews on the Hebrew side against the Phoenicians and against others. And David did not want it to be known that he had had this tryst with this woman and caused her to be pregnant. So he sent, at the time of the year when everyone else he had sent them out into battle, he was not out there leading them himself like he used to. He sent messages to one of his generals to say, bring me Uriah the Hittite, bring him to my castle, and or my palace. And he was brought there, and he honored Uriah and offered him wine and asked him to make merry and get drunk and have intercourse with his wife and all this sort of thing. And Uriah was such a noble man, he refused to do so. He said, I cannot do this while my brothers are out on the battlefield dying. And so, unable to induce Uriah into sleeping with Bathsheba so that Uriah would think the child was his, he gave Uriah a note to take to his generals. And the note said, when the battle gets thick and heavy, withdraw from Uriah and let him be slaughtered. And he gave the note to Uriah and said, don't read this, just give it to your generals. And of course Uriah was so faithful that he did just as told, and they did as they were told, and he was killed. Now, not long after that, one of the prophets who lived probably in a community in the desert, whose name was Nathan, which means the one who is sent by God, came to King David and desired an audience. And when he came before King David, he said, I want to tell you a story and ask you what kind of punishment should be given to this man. And he said, tell on. And he said, well, there was a poor man who had only one ewe, a female lamb, and that ewe was basically his pet, and they nursed it, and the children played with it, and they called it by name. A very wealthy man who had all kinds of sheep saw this ewe and wanted it for himself, so he came and he took it by force away from these people, and he slaughtered it and he ate it. What should be done with this man? And David was very angry, and he said, as I live, that man should die. And Nathan looked at him and pointed right at him and said, you are the man. Because what David had done with Bathsheba and Uriah, although it was not known to other people, it was known to the prophets and those guided by God. And immediately, David's response was not like that of any other Middle Eastern potentate, which would have been chop his head off, because whatever the king wants is what defines what is right. But David obviously was beholden to a higher law, a Torah that existed even at his time. It was not just a conscience, but a law. And he knew he was wrong, and he knew he had offended God, and he knew that Nathan had spoken the truth. And immediately, when his generals and people said, give us the word, we'll chop his head off, and he said, no, send him away in peace. And immediately he went into mourning. And the child of David and Bathsheba was born dead. And later, when he got back into the war and was walking with his generals on the road, other prophets, anonymous prophets, would come up and throw dust at him and say, you stink, and all that sort of thing. And when the generals would ask if they should lop their heads off, he said, no, let them keep throwing the dust. Here we have wonderful earliest form of Jewish guilt. And guilty he was. So David is a very human character, and there are many stories told about David, many legends told about David. It gives you a strong idea that there is quite a difference already now between the monarchy and the prophetic movement. There are two things going on here. There is the monarchy who rules and the government who rules, and then there are the prophets who are the ones really respected, who hold the basic tenets of the religion that allows the nation to even exist, and they are not always in agreement. And very often the prophets will be in opposition to the monarch. Now, we're talking about a period about 1 millennium before the time of Yeshua. The successor of David was Solomon. Solomon, whose great reputation as the most learned of all men and the wisest of all judges, and the greatest of all, who knew the greatest magic and the secret and occult knowledge that came from the angels and so on. This is the reputation of Solomon down to the time of Yeshua. The songs of Solomon, the psalms of Solomon, and the magic of Solomon, and so on. In fact, Solomon was a ruler who was pretty much hated by his subjects because he taxed them very, very hard in order to build his temple. And he built a temple to God. And before that time, the ark had not been housed in a house built by human hands. It was in a tabernacle, a tent. And again, this was something the prophets did not want. They didn't believe there should be a king, and there definitely should not be an imitation temple like you had among the Edomites and the other nations who had these things. But Solomon's temple was built, not only was it built as a temple, as a house for God, but it was also built in imitation of these other Near Eastern temples, because Judaism had no history and no traditions and no guilds dealing with stonemasonry. They had people who were skilled at certain things, silver crafting and things like this. But they actually had to go, Solomon had to go to other countries and other nations to procure the architects and the builders. And what they built, what they ended up with, was something that was had very many of the same other kinds of themes and the kinds of statues and the kinds of images that you would find in temples of other Near Eastern countries. And Israel was now a single state. There were people were very highly taxed. Many of them were put into forced labor and servitude to build the temple, but it was a single state. But when Solomon died, it fell into two states because there was so much internal conflict, and he was such an unpopular ruler that this happened that it eventually fell into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and it was also known as the kingdom of the Omri, and its temple or its center would be in Samaria at other cities, and then Jerusalem, and Judah, which was the southern kingdom. So we have at this time now, Israel now morphs into two states, a northern and a southern kingdom, Israel and Judah, as we call her, Judea, as we know. Here is one artist's rendering of the anointing of King David by the prophet Samuel. To be anointed with oil, olive oil, to be crowned was to be anointed, because the oil symbolized the blessing and the approval of God through the priesthood or the mediation of the prophets. So the prophets were the ones called upon to crown and name and approve the king and the ruler. So here is Samuel anointing, or actually another prophet anointing or christing King David, and the prophet Samuel approving. And this This whole pattern went down through Christianity. The Pope had to crown kings and things like this, and the whole issue of what powers belong to the church and what powers belong to the state. This was going on way back at the time of the beginning of the Hebrew state. So there was a priestly national religion. The king or ruler of each of the states, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, had their own priesthood and their own temples. And each of them were dedicated to Yahweh. This is some idea of what the temple at Jerusalem was like. We don't know exactly, but we have descriptions and some archaeological remains. You'll notice that there is a smoking altar where beasts are sacrificed, a huge basin where the priests wash themselves and bathe themselves, and then steps leading up between two columns, one on the right, one on the left, that takes them into the temple. Now, if we look at King Solomon's temple as we understand what it was like, the altar of sacrifice in front, the basin of water at the side. This is also known as the molten sea. It was used to clean and wash animals after sacrifice and before sacrifice. Animals were bled. The life was taken out by having their throats cut. This is kosher killing of an animal. It's very painless compared to the way that animals are killed today, with being whacked with baseball with bats and mallets on their heads and things like this. And animals were sacrificed, and there was a great deal of this kind of thing going on every day. This was part of ancient religion. Sacrifice was a basic part of it. Here we have an illustration of what the inner part of the temple would have looked like. We have the altar in front, and the molten sea, or the laver, the washing place, and the steps up between the pillars, the two great pillars. And then we have the holy place, which is a large room. It has stands and tables for what was called the showbread, and an altar of incense. And then beyond that was the Holy of Holies. It was a smaller room with cherubim and the Ark of the Covenant. This is another representation of the larger room with steps leading up to the Holy of Holies. And we have winged cherubim, winged beasts that are very much the same kinds of creatures you'll find in Assyrian and other Near Eastern temples. And here we have the cherubim, the winged cherubim. These later will be part of the vision of Ezekiel when he sees God in his Merkaba, or chariot throne. And then on the table, the ark. This is one representation. By permission of the Freemasonic Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, I'm going to show you some replications that give you some idea of what the Ark of the Covenant might have looked like. It was lavered in gold, and it held the second version, the Ten Commandments of the laws given to the Hebrews by God. The poles that are stuck through the outer sides of the ark were used when it was, before it was part of a temple. It was carried around. It was in a tabernacle, and it was carried by people, by 4 people. And at the top we have the cherubim with their wings outstretched protectively. This is the showbread. This is the replication that we would find in the temple as it is shown in Phoenix, Arizona. There are different replications in different places. You might recall that Jesus, when he took his disciples through the fields on a Sabbath that had already been harvested, and he gleaned the grains from the field so they could eat, he was criticized for working on the Sabbath, and the justification he gave was that David, when he was hungry and his men had nothing to eat, went into the temple and took the showbread and distributed it. So this anyway would be what was called the showbread. These are some other items that the museum has put together for people. Judaism and the Temple of Solomon are absolutely intrinsic and basic to all the allegories and spiritual teachings of Freemasonry. Now, the high priest in a temple was a Baal Shem. He was a master or lord of the name. The name was Yod-He-Vav-He, Yahweh. The name was not supposed to be spoken except certain times, and it was not probably spoken. It was probably intoned, and it was probably harmonically intoned. And the high priest learned how to intone the name so that once a year, when he entered the Holy of Holies to seek atonement for Israel on the Day of Atonement, he would pronounce the name. And if he made any mistakes, he'd come out dead. They attached a rope to him. They'd have to pull him out of the Holy of Holies because he'd be struck dead. And this became the context for the kind of cosmic imagery we find in Merkaba mysticism, the mysticism of divine ascent to the chariot throne of God. Yahweh was considered to dwell on a special kind of throne that was not a fixed throne, but it could be anywhere. And it was like the chariot throne of the Assyrian and other warrior kings. The mysticism of the priests and the prophets and the high priesthood converged around the pronunciation of the sacred name. In the priesthood, there was a breastplate that was worn. This is one representation of how it might have been and what the stones would have been according to Scripture. There were 12 stones, some say representing the 12 tribes, although in all Jewish paraphernalia today, when you look at inscriptions on Hanukkah candlesticks and things like this, you'll always find the 12 tribes equated with the 12 signs of the zodiac. Judaism did not really develop a whole knowledge of astrology until after the contact with the Babylonians, where the Magi were, in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Christian era. So when the biblical texts were written down by the priestly source, who codified things at that time and after that time of that contact, we have a great deal of things in the Old Testament that refer to astrological things. The stars are put into the sky by God for not just times and seasons, but for other kinds of prognostication, and things like the 12 tribes of Israel rather than the 14 or the 15, and the 12 stones in the breastplate, and so on. There was a mysticism of contact with and sacred theurgical work with God that was done by the priesthood, and the prophets had a direct connection with God that was done through their own sacrifice, not the sacrifice of animals, but the sacrifice of their lives. And so we had quite a difference between the religion of the prophets and the religion of the priests in Israel and Judah. Now, the ancient traditions that go back to Melchizedek and back to Jethro were shamanic traditions. And they were the traditions of direct contact by the seeker in the desert with the strange and high mysteries of God and the voice of God. And they became what we call the shamanic prophet priests of Israel. Melchizedek, before the time that Israel existed, such as Israel, was the the priest of the Most High God, but he had no temple. He had no house of God. He was a priest without a temple. And so were the prophets. Now, at the time of Moses and Aaron, the priesthood and the prophecy became separate institutions. In fact, Moses designated Aaron as the first priest of Israel, according to the legends that we read in the Pentateuch. And of course, the legends are written down 700 years after they really would have taken place, and probably reflect all the intervening things and developments and changes that have happened. But according to legend, Moses, who is the great prophet and lawgiver of Israel, designates Aaron as his priest. And Moses, according to legend, was a stutterer. He could not speak well, and so Aaron was his spokesperson. Aaron spoke for him. So we have sort of the separating of the institutions of the prophet and of the priest, but this probably happens later in history. The prophets, the earliest prophets we read about, like Nathan and so on, seem to have been hermits. They lived in the desert. The word hermit is eremite in Greek, which means one who lives in the desert. And after around 1,000 years before the Christian era, they seem to live actually in communities. There may have been communities of prophets or prophetic guilds. Nathan, Elijah, Elisha, and these prophets were generally ascetic. They were not married. They were what later would be called Nazarites. They never trimmed their beards, and they dedicated their lives to serving Yahweh. And then we have, after the time of Solomon, we have prophet citizens who are citizens of Israel and citizens of Judah, but especially of Israel, who deliver prophecies because they're called upon by God to do so. These would be prophets like Amos and Hosea, etc., who were married and lived lives as regular citizens and then delivered the prophecies of God. And finally, after the time of as we approach the time of the destruction of Israel and the time of the original prophet Isaiah, and you have to realize that in the book of Isaiah there are 3 levels. We have what we call Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah. All the books of the Isaiah school are produced over a few centuries by the school of Isaiah, who is a great founding prophet. That the school of Isaiah is a place where prophetic and priestly mysticism come together. And Isaiah and Ezekiel and all these others were those who brought together the kind of mysticism that would be so powerful at the time of Yeshua, Merkaba mysticism, Kabbalistic mysticism, which was based on experiences of ascent to the throne of God. Now, the prophets found themselves very much at odds with the monarchs and the kings and the rulers. Now, it was quite a milestone that a prophet would choose to anoint or to officially give the imprimatur of the holy men of Israel to Saul as a king of all Israel. And it was probably done in extremis because of the fact that they needed leadership in order to overcome the threat of the Phoenicians. But King David was considered to be not just a monarch, but to be a prophet. He was considered to be a proper king of Israel, one who was a warrior king who went forth with his men into battle, but who also could sing and dance and go into the frenzies of the prophets. But even he was opposed by Nathan and others when he left the path of righteousness. And this opposition would continue throughout the history of Israel and Judah. In the northern kingdom, the kingdom known as the Omri, or Israel, we had prophets like Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and Elijah, who opposed the kings and their queens like Jezebel, who strayed very far from the original prophetic religion. And their opposition became very strong and very fierce. And they predicted the demise of the kingdom, that it would be destroyed and carried away by the Assyrians, and that did in fact come into history and into existence, and Israel was destroyed. The southern kingdom, Judah, survived, and through the interaction of prophetic families and priestly families, a reform was exercised. It's called the Deuteronomic reform of Josiah. Supposedly, there was found a book of Moses in the deep cellars of the temple at Jerusalem, in the archives somewhere. And we think probably it was written by Elkiah, who was the father of Jeremiah, who was the high priest. But in it speaks, the book of Deuteronomy, as we know it, is supposed to be written by Moses and contains all kinds of different laws, new laws, very different than the kind of martial law kinds of laws that you find in the book of Numbers and so on, and Leviticus. And in Deuteronomy, you find laws that no longer apply to a series of tribes on martial alert all the time, where there has to be very harsh martial law and so on. You find laws that apply to settled agrarian kind of culture and civilization, like you have in Judea and in the nation of Judah. And the king causes it to be read to all people, and a basic reform takes place in which the religion of the prophets and the religion of the priests really becomes the same thing, the same religion. And this has a massive influence on Jewish religion. It doesn't stop the destruction of Judah, which happens a century later, but it has a very powerful effect on the religion of Israel. Nevertheless, inevitably, Judah, which remains now 100 years after Israel has been wiped out by the Assyrians, and what remains is Judah with its capital city of Jerusalem and its Temple of Solomon, which is different. You have to realize that in the northern kingdom there was a different capital city and a different temple. That dominated, and that form of religion dominated, and that form of spin was what was to be later put on all the documents that we call the Old Testament about who was a good king, who was a bad king, and what they all did, and so on. So when you read the books of the kings and things like that, you're hearing it from the perspective of the southern kingdom. And what happens is that Judah is finally conquered by Babylon, by the Persians, and all the princes and all the literate people and all the people of any consequence are carried into captivity to Babylon in order to keep them from reorganizing and retaking the area. And it's at that point that the school of Isaiah, which has gone for a couple of generations into the writings that we call Deutero-Isaiah, or the latter parts of the book of Isaiah, are written as what we call Trito-Isaiah, and Zechariah, and Daniel, and the other books, Daniel being the latest of them, are actually written in Aramaic. And we have the movements, the Hasidic movement that will eventually result in the synagogue movement, and the development of Merkaba mysticism and messianic hopes for leadership in Israel. Here's the story, a little depiction of the story of Elijah, who is called upon by God to go to battle against the priests of Baal, the priests of the of another god who has been brought into the temple by Jezebel, the wife of the king, who wants to have that kind of worship, etc. And so he defeats them in a battle in which sacrificial animals are put onto an altar, and he calls down fire from heaven. And then he ends up burning up all the other priests and slaying all the other priests, etc. Here is a representation of this miraculous event. Elijah is the really the sine qua non of the prophets of Israel. He is the great prophet of Israel. He is the prophet who will come, according to later writings of later prophets, the one who will come to turn the hearts of the fathers to the sons and the sons to the fathers before the great and terrible day of the Lord, which is before the coming of the Mashiach, the Messiah. Now, about 840 years before the Christian era, this is what the territory was that included Israel. And it was basically the area that we would think of as the Galilee and north of that. And this is the area that was called Judah, and that's where Jerusalem is, and the great Dead Sea, where we find the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on. So, as both nations are conquered and their priests, their priesthood traditions and their court chronicles and things like this are kept in archives or in scrolls by people who carry them off to Babylon, we find that it's at this point that the Old Testament is actually written. And there are different streams of tradition we find when it's written. It's written by the priests, which we call the priestly source. We call it P. And they weave together sources from the northern kingdom and from the southern kingdom, and very often the same story is told twice in different variations. From Israel, we have documents and legends and stories and chronicles and things in which God is always addressed as Elohim, which is actually the plural of the word God, El. We find this used at the beginning of the Old Testament in the first chapter, the book of Genesis. So we call this the E-source. Whenever we find God being called Elohim, it seems to tie together with a whole series of stories and legends and things that are associated with northern Israel. And the kingdom of northern Israel, by the way, was not known as Israel to its neighbors. It was known as the kingdom of the Omri. And its capital and its sanctuary and its temple were in Bethel, and it was in the area that we know as Samaria. Later on, the Samaritans will be people who are the descendants of many of those who lived in Samaria. And there are many prophets from this tradition that we know: Amos, Elijah, Elisha, and Jezebel. I'm going to read you from the prophet Amos. Now, Amos's situation was this. He lived at a time during the reign of Jeroboam II, from about 786 to 746 before the Christian era. There was a tremendous amount of wealth, but because of that there was a tremendous distinction between the rich and the poor, and there was a lot of immorality in the court and in the major cities. And he was a shepherd who lived in the small Judean village of Tekoa, and he came to the very temple where the priests were in Bethel. And he delivered a series of stinging prophecies in which he prophesied doom for what seemed to be a completely secure country. And it begins this way: the words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw, the words that he saw. Very often we get this mixed metaphor, the words, something he saw, the vision that he spoke, and so on. It's a kind of a mixed sense thing. concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. For thus says the Lord, For 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron, and so on. Well, he begins by trashing the enemies of Israel. Damascus is one of the enemies of Israel. Damascus has done things that are wrong. They attacked Gilead with iron weapons and had no mercy upon them, and they basically invaded them. And so he prophesies that he will destroy and break Damascus. And so you can imagine people standing around saying, yeah, good, that's right, that's the way it ought to be. And then he says, For 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they carried into exile a whole people to deliver them up to Edom. And then he tells about the bad things God is going to do, and so on. Now, you have to realize that the Assyrians were people who used iron weapons. And when it says that they have threshed Gilead, they're referring to something really very gross. You see, in a battle, when the battle was over and there were many people writhing, half dead and half alive and wounded on the field, it was considered to be military courtesy to go and kill them one by one with a spear. But the Assyrians had come up with a whole new thing, wholesale butchery. So they had learned to weld iron blades onto their chariot wheels and just run them through the fields of the writhing bodies, slashing them to pieces. And this is what's meant by, they have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. And so Amos goes on to point out the moral transgressions of other nations and how God is going to punish them. And you can imagine that the priests and the other people hearing his prophecy are kind of applauding. Oh yeah, those are bad guys, they're really going to get it. And then he even says, For 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they have rejected the law of the Lord, and they have not kept his statutes, etc., etc. Now this is, of course, their neighbor country, the other country and the other kingship that claims the same God as Israel does. And of course now the priests are very, very happy, because of course their religion is the right version of Hebrew religion, not the Judean version. And so yes, of course God is going to punish them. And then he says, Thus says the Lord, For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment. Whoa, what is he doing? Now he's saying God is going to punish us, Israel. Why? Because they sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of shoes. They that trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, and turn aside the way of the afflicted. He is telling them that for the social injustices and inequities between the rich and the poor, and for their immorality, God is going to punish them. A man and his father go into the same maiden, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar upon garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. They're making they're breaking with the religious traditions. And as he says, Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, etc., etc., etc. But you made the Nazarites drink wine. These are the ascetics who pledged their lives to God, never to put a razor on their head. And you commanded the prophets, saying, You shall not prophesy. And so here is what Amos sees for these kinds of offenses. He says, Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are in the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, Bring that we may drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness that, behold, the days are coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks, etc., etc. And that was the way that the nobility of a country, when it was captured, were led away in captivity, and very often with cords that were strung right through their noses. And then he talks about the priests. He says, welcome to Bethel. Come to Bethel and transgress. Not come to Bethel and worship, but come to Bethel, the temple, and transgress. To Gilgal and multiply transgressions. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving of that which is leavened, and proclaim freewill offerings. Publish them, for so you love to do, O people of Israel. And he finally ends with a very powerful statement. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fatted beasts I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Did you bring to me sacrifices and offerings the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? And this was the prophetic view, that righteousness, justice, was the essence of what true religion was. This whole business with priests and animal sacrifice and songs and singing praises and all this sort of thing was just lip service. It meant nothing compared to the true religion that people were expected to express. And then in 722, the Assyrian conquest came, and exactly what he had prophesied, and some other prophets, came true. Israel was absolutely and utterly destroyed. Now, from that history of Judaism, of Hebrew religion, we have court chronicles and many other legends and things in which the name normally used of God is Elohim. So we call that material the E source. But now we also have materials that the priests in Babylon used to put together what today we call the Old Testament, that come from the southern kingdom, Judah. And there the name used for God was Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahweh, J. And so we call this the J source. This was the southern kingdom. It was the kingdom of David, who were known also as the sons of Yahweh. And Jerusalem was its capital. And some of the great prophets that we know from that are Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and the school of Isaiah, which is a school of priesthood and prophecy. Now I'm going to read you from the 6th chapter of the book of Isaiah, because it's in the early chapters that the historical prophecies of the prophet Isaiah are preserved. But the school of Isaiah went on for many generations, and we have what we call a Deutero-Isaiah and a Trito-Isaiah in the later sections of the book of Isaiah. And from these much later prophetic visions, we get much of the imagery and so on that you'll find in the book of the Christian book of Revelations, the Apocalypse of John, and things that are very important to Messianic theory later on. So here's what he says. Isaiah, now he's probably dictating to one of his disciples who writes this down. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And here the word for Lord is Adonai. And above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. That is still used today in worship services. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And it sounds very, very much like a description of a priest having a vision in the temple filled with incense, seeing the the cherubim, the animals over the Holy of Holies, and so on. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Yahweh of hosts, the Lord of hosts. And here we have in the King James and other Bibles, the word Lord now is capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That's a tip-off that the word here is Yahweh, Yod-He, Vav-He. It was never pronounced, and it still is never pronounced in among Jews in reading this word. When they come upon it, they take the they simply substitute the word Adonai, which is we see with this capital L and small O-R-D when it's used. And Protestants later took it and they put the vowels in from the word Adonai and turned it into Jehovah. But mine eyes have seen the King, the Yahweh of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphim to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar, which is, of course, the altar of the temple. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin forgiven. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, and here's the word is Adonai, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, Hear and hear, but do not understand. See and see, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people fat, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. This is language you hear Jesus using when he speaks to people, and he says that you must, that people seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, and so on. So this is prophetic language, and this is a burden of a prophecy, a very negative prophecy that is to be given to people. It would be good to read Isaiah all the way through at some point in your career and to learn what the teachings were in that whole school and how that led us from ancient Hebrew religion into the kind of religion that eventually was part of the world and concepts of Yeshua. And of course, Judah then was finally invaded and taken down by the Persians, the Babylonian conquest in the 6th century before the Christian era. All the people with any education were taken wholesale and transplanted into Babylon, over by where the ancient city of Ur had been, where Abraham had begun. And they became part of the kingdom that had a Zoroastrian astrology-based religion, and were actually very well received by the royalty of the Babylonians and well treated in many cases, although they had to bow down in certain ways for certain things. And there in Babylon is where the most significant things happened that really created Judaism as we know it today, because there was no longer a nation, there was no longer a temple, there was no longer a country. What there was were legends and stories and chronicles and texts. And these were put together by the priests of the priestly tradition of the temple and knitted together into the books we know as Genesis, Exodus, and so on. And these books are all sourced through materials that we call the J source and the E source and the P source, and then there's a Deuteronomic source and some other things. And we'll find if we read them carefully, if you look, for example, at the story of Noah and the flood, you will find that there are two stories there that you can unscramble. In one of them, the name of God is always Elohim. In the other one, it's always Yahweh. In one of the stories, Noah takes animals 2 by 2 into the ark. In the other story, he takes them 7 by 7. And there are many other things like this. Even the story of the creation of Adam and Eve. There is one story about the rib being taken out of Adam, etc. And there's another story that's very different, in which creation takes place in a desert and so on. So as scholars have learned to comb through these, the sources that were used by the people who put together the first 5 books and then later the first 6 books, what we call the Torah of the Old Testament, and what eventually grew into the Bible, which was the Torah and the prophets, and what was just called the writings, which are the Psalms and other things like this. We developed a literary tradition in Israel, and that became the backbone for worship outside of the temple, no longer based on animal sacrifice, but upon the gathering together in a synagogue and reading of Scripture together and celebrating of special days and holidays in a Jewish year.